It has been exactly 3 days, 14 hours, and 22 minutes since I sent that message asking her out, and in that time, I have replayed every interaction we have ever had in my mind at least 100 times, searching for some clue, some hidden meaning, some explanation for why the woman who was so engaged, so curious, so genuinely enthusiastic about getting to know me has suddenly disappeared into the silent void of a read receipt that never came. We matched on a dating app a week ago, a Tuesday evening that I remember precisely because I had been having a particularly awful day at work and her profile had been a bright spot in an otherwise grey and exhausting week. She was beautiful, obviously, but more than that, her bio was funny and smart and hinted at the kind of depth that I had been looking for in a partner, the kind of person who could hold a conversation about something other than themselves, who had passions and interests and the ability to articulate them without turning it into a performance. I had sent her a message, a simple opener that referenced something in her profile, not a cheesy pickup line but a genuine attempt to connect, and to my surprise, she had responded within an hour, matching my energy and enthusiasm with her own. The messages that followed were not the typical dating app exchange, the kind of dry back and forth that fizzles out after a few days when both parties realize they have nothing to say to each other. Instead, they were substantial, thoughtful, the kind of messages that suggested she was actually interested in getting to know me as a person, not just as another face in her match queue. The timing was always a little off, a message a day from each of us, not because of a lack of interest but because of bad luck, because we both had demanding jobs, because our schedules seemed to align in the most awkward way, with her messages coming in during my work hours and mine coming in during hers. But despite the delay, the content was never lacking. She asked questions, not just the superficial ones about where I grew up or what I did for work, but the deeper ones that suggested she was trying to understand what made me tick, what I cared about, what I believed in. She shared personal things about herself, her history, her fears, her dreams, the kind of vulnerability that takes a certain amount of trust to offer to a stranger, and I reciprocated, opening up to her in ways that I usually reserved for people I had known for months, not days. She mentioned that she wanted to hear my law dumps, which was a phrase that immediately made me smile because it suggested she was familiar with the kind of intense, hyper-specific interests that I had spent my life cultivating but rarely sharing with anyone outside my closest friends. She seemed genuine, not just in her words but in the way she engaged with mine, responding to every detail I offered and building on it, creating the kind of conversation that felt less like the preliminary stage of dating and more like the beginning of an actual connection. The messages had become something I looked forward to, a daily touchpoint that made the routine of my life feel slightly more significant, and I had allowed myself to imagine what it might be like to meet her in person, to see if the chemistry that existed in text could translate to real life. She had mentioned a few times that she was busy, that work was crazy, that she had family obligations, but she always made it clear that she wanted to continue the conversation, that she was just as invested as I was in seeing where this might go. On Friday, I had asked her out, a simple question that felt both terrifying and exhilarating to type, the kind of step that marks the transition from the safety of digital interaction to the vulnerability of real-world connection. I had suggested a casual coffee date, nothing too formal or pressure-filled, just a chance to meet in person and see if the spark we had felt over text would translate to something tangible. I had sent the message and then put my phone down, not expecting an immediate response because she was at work, because it was Friday and people were busy, because the messages between us had always had a lag and I had accepted that as part of our dynamic. But as the hours passed and then the days, the silence grew louder, the absence of a response becoming a statement in itself, a rejection that I was not prepared to accept because it felt so incongruent with everything that had come before. I have found myself doing the thing that I know is unhealthy, the thing that everyone who has ever been ghosted has done, which is checking her profile repeatedly, looking for some sign that she is still active, that she is still out there, that my message is not sitting in her inbox like a forgotten artifact but is simply waiting for her to have the time and energy to respond. I have reread our messages more times than I care to admit, looking for a sign, a warning, a subtle shift in tone that would have predicted this silence. I have analyzed the length of her messages, the frequency of her replies, the emoji she used, the exclamation point she added, trying to find some code that would explain why someone who seemed so interested would suddenly disappear. I have wondered if I said something wrong, if my message asking her out was too forward or too casual, if I should have phrased it differently, if I should have waited longer, if I should have done something, anything, to avoid the outcome that now seems inevitable. I have considered the possibility that she is just busy, that her silence is temporary, that she will eventually respond with an apology and an explanation and we will pick up where we left off and this will all become a funny story we tell at our wedding about how I almost gave up on her after 3 days of radio silence. I have also considered the more painful possibility that she has simply changed her mind, that her interest was never as genuine as it seemed, that she was just being polite or bored or looking for validation and I was the convenient recipient of her attention until something better came along. The term ghosting is relatively new in the lexicon of human interaction, but the experience itself is as old as social relationships, the sudden and unexplained cessation of communication from someone who was previously engaged and present, leaving the other person to wonder what went wrong and why they were not worth the simple courtesy of an explanation. In the digital age, ghosting has become almost ubiquitous, a feature of the dating landscape that is so common that most people expect it to happen at least a few times before they find someone who sticks. But expectation does not make the experience any less painful, any less confusing, any less damaging to the fragile sense of self that we bring to the dating process. I have been ghosted before, multiple times, by people who seemed just as interested as she did, and I have learned that the experience never gets easier, that each new instance of ghosting carries its own particular sting, its own unique form of rejection that feels personal even when I know intellectually that it has more to do with the other person than with me. I have tried to rationalize it, to tell myself that someone who would ghost me after a week of solid conversation is not someone I would want to be with anyway, that their inability to communicate directly and honestly is a red flag that I should be grateful to discover early rather than later. But rationalization is cold comfort when what I really want is answers, when what I really need is to understand why she has disappeared, when what I really crave is the closure that she has denied me by simply not responding. I have been thinking about the concept of bad timing and whether it is a legitimate excuse or just a convenient way of saying that someone is not as interested as they initially seemed. The message-a-day rhythm that characterized our conversations was frustrating, but it was also understandable, given that both of us had busy lives and the kind of jobs that demanded our attention during the hours when most people are free to engage in casual conversation. She mentioned that she had a lot going on, that her work was demanding, that she was dealing with family stuff, and I had accepted these explanations because they seemed genuine and because I wanted to believe that the connection we were building was worth the wait. But as the silence stretches into its third day, I find myself wondering if bad timing was always just a polite way of saying that she was not that into me, that her enthusiasm was a performance, that the connection I felt was one-sided and I was too eager to notice. I have considered the possibility that she met someone else, that another match captured her attention more effectively than I did, that the dating app ecosystem is so saturated with options that even a promising conversation can be abandoned without a second thought when something shinier comes along. I have considered the possibility that she is going through something personal, that her silence has nothing to do with me and everything to do with her own struggles, that she will eventually resurface with an explanation and an apology and we will both look back on this period as a temporary bump in the road. I have considered every possibility, turned every stone, examined every angle, and I am still no closer to understanding why she has not responded. The question of how long I should wait before giving up is one that has no easy answer, no universal guideline that applies to every situation, no rulebook that tells you exactly when it is safe to stop hoping and start moving on. Some people say you should wait a day, that if someone does not respond within 24 hours, they are not interested and you should move on immediately. Others say you should wait 3 days, that life is complicated and people get busy and a delayed response is not necessarily a sign of disinterest. Still others say you should wait a week, that the modern world is chaotic and demanding and sometimes people simply do not have the bandwidth to respond to messages, even to people they genuinely care about. The internet is full of advice, some of it contradictory, some of it helpful, some of it entirely useless, and I have read most of it in the last 3 days, trying to find something that will tell me what to do, how to feel, what to expect. The consensus seems to be that if someone is interested, they will make time for you, that the too busy excuse is almost always a polite fiction, that people prioritize what they care about and if she cared about me, she would have responded by now. But I have also found stories, dozens of them, from people who were ghosted for days or weeks and then received a response, an apology, an explanation that made sense and led to a real, lasting relationship. I have found hope in those stories, a desperate clinging to the possibility that my situation is different, that my experience is the exception rather than the rule, that she will eventually respond and everything will be fine. I have considered the possibility of sending a follow-up message, a gentle nudge that would remind her that I exist and that I am still interested, without coming across as desperate or demanding. Some people advise against this, arguing that if someone is ignoring you, reaching out again only makes you look needy and devalues your own self-worth. Others argue that a single follow-up is acceptable, that it shows confidence and initiative, that it demonstrates that you are not willing to let a good thing slip away without a fight. I have typed and deleted a follow-up message at least a dozen times, trying to find the perfect tone, the right words, the phrasing that would express my interest without applying pressure, my confusion without sounding accusatory, my hope without seeming naive. I have thought about asking if everything is okay, about mentioning that I have noticed the silence and wondered if there is a reason, about simply saying that I am still interested and leaving the ball in her court. I have not sent any of these messages because I am afraid of how they will be received, afraid of the vulnerability they represent, afraid that the answer will be worse than the question, that a direct rejection will hurt more than this ambiguous silence. The silence, at least, leaves room for hope, allows me to believe that there is still a chance, that she will eventually respond and everything will be okay. A rejection, on the other hand, would be final, would close the door on the possibility of something real and meaningful, would force me to accept that the connection I felt was not as mutual as I believed. I have been thinking about the nature of digital communication and how it has changed the way we form and maintain relationships. Before the internet, people met in person, read each other's body language, heard each other's voices, and made judgments based on a full range of sensory information. Now, we communicate through screens, typing words that can be edited and deleted and reconsidered before they are sent, creating a curated version of ourselves that may or may not reflect who we actually are. The messages we exchange are artifacts, records of interactions that can be analyzed and reanalyzed, each word weighted for meaning, each pause interpreted as a sign of something. I have become an expert at reading between the lines, at extracting meaning from the subtext, at finding significance in the most trivial details. The time of day she sent her messages, the length of her responses, the use of emojis or punctuation, all of it has become data that I have used to construct a narrative about who she is and what she wants. But the data is incomplete, the narrative is a fiction, and I am left with nothing but questions and the silence that seems to be the only reliable response I have received in the last 72 hours. I know that I should not let this consume me, that 3 days is not that long in the grand scheme of things, that I have a life to live and a job to do and other matches on the app that deserve my attention. But I cannot shake the feeling that this was different, that she was different, that the connection we built in those messages was too real, too authentic to be dismissed so casually. The irony of my situation is not lost on me. I have spent the last week developing a connection with someone I have never met, building a fantasy version of a relationship that existed only in messages and imagination, and now I am experiencing the pain of losing someone who was never really mine to begin with. The grief I feel is out of proportion to the relationship, disproportionate to the brief and tenuous nature of the connection, but it is real nonetheless, a reflection of the hope I invested in this possibility and the disappointment I feel now that it seems to have slipped away. I have been thinking about what I would say to her if she did respond, the words I would use to express how I feel without making it weird, the balance I would strike between honesty and restraint, the way I would communicate my interest without overwhelming her with the depth of my feelings. I have imagined her response, the apology she would offer, the explanation she would give, the way we would resume our conversation as if nothing had happened and move forward toward the date that was always supposed to happen. I have also imagined the alternative, the message that would tell me she was not interested, that she had met someone else, that she had changed her mind, and I have steeled myself for that possibility as well, practicing the grace and dignity I would need to accept the rejection without collapsing into self-pity or bitterness. The advice I have been given by friends and family is a familiar refrain, the well-meaning platitudes that people offer when they do not know what else to say. There are plenty of fish in the sea, they tell me, and I know they mean well, but the phrase feels dismissive. Reducing what I experienced to a mere numbers game, a transaction in a dating market where people are interchangeable and emotions are disposable. If she was interested, she would have responded, they say, and I know there is truth in that, but it does not account for the complexity of human behavior, the countless reasons someone might delay a response, the myriad factors that could explain her silence without diminishing her interest. You dodged a bullet, they tell me, and I can see the logic in that, the idea that someone who would ghost you after a week is not someone you want to be with, but it does not erase the pain I feel or the loss of what might have been. I have learned to nod and smile, to accept the advice without fully accepting the sentiment, to hold on to my own hope even as others encourage me to let it go. I am not ready to give up on this possibility, not ready to accept that her silence is final, not ready to close the door on what might have been the beginning of something real. I have been thinking about the concept of patience and whether it is a virtue or a weakness in the context of modern dating. In a world where everything is fast, where we expect instant responses and immediate gratification, the act of waiting has become an anachronism, a foreign concept that feels almost subversive. We are conditioned to move on quickly, to swipe left and right without pause, to treat potential partners as options rather than individuals, to prioritize efficiency over depth. I am guilty of this myself, having abandoned matches after a few days of lackluster conversation, having written off people who did not meet my expectations quickly enough, having participated in the same transactional culture that I now rail against. But with her, it was different. She captured my attention in a way that few people have, and I am not willing to let that go without a fight, without giving her the benefit of the doubt, without extending the patience and understanding that I would want someone to extend to me if our positions were reversed. I have decided to wait, to give her a week before I send any follow-up message, to allow her the space and time to respond on her own terms, to trust that if the connection was as real as it felt, she will not let it fade into oblivion without some acknowledgement. It is a gamble, a bet on hope and patience and the possibility that the story we started writing is not over yet, that there is still a chapter to be written, that the silence between messages is just a pause, not an ending. But even as I wait, I am also preparing myself for the possibility that she will never respond, that I will be left with nothing but questions and the memory of a week of conversation that felt like the beginning of something beautiful. I have started to write a message in my mind, the final message I will send if a week passes and I have not heard from her, a message that is not bitter or accusatory but honest, that acknowledges the disappointment I feel without blaming her, that wishes her well even as I say goodbye. It is a message I hope I never have to send, but I know that I must be prepared to send it, because the alternative is to remain in this limbo indefinitely, to hold on to hope that has become more painful than the rejection I am trying to avoid. I have been thinking about what I will do if she does not respond, how I will process the grief and disappointment, how I will move on to the next match, the next conversation, the next possibility. I know that I will be okay, that I have survived disappointment before and will survive it again, that the pain of this experience will fade with time and distance, that eventually I will look back on this week and see it for what it was, a brief moment of connection that did not lead to anything more. But for now, in this moment, the silence is still fresh, the hope is still alive, and I am still waiting for her to respond, still believing that she will, still hoping that the story I started writing with her is not yet complete.